This episode of Life and Books and Everything is brought to you by Crossway, publisher of the Message of the Old Testament and the Message of the New Testament. I have both of these books. I have used them often. They're based on sermons from Mark Dever's early ministry at Capitol Hill Baptist Church, preached one sermon on each book of the Bible, and did a really excellent job summarizing them. It's a great way to get acclimated with each book, especially some of the longer books that are maybe harder to get a quick summary. So the Message of the Old Testament, Message of the New Testament, really good, practical, pastoral, yet serious, scholarly engagement. Encourage you to check out these books, and you can pick up a copy wherever books are sold or visit crossway.org/promise to learn how you can get 30% off with a free Crossway Plus account. We also want to thank our friends at Desiring God for supporting the podcast. DG is celebrating the relaunch of its namesake book, Desiring God. Not many books by living authors probably deserve to be called a classic, but this is one of those living classics that I think will be read for a long time. Published nearly 40 years ago, now Crossway is releasing a revised edition. So if you haven't read this, or you feel like, well, I think I know all about Desiring God, but you actually haven't read the book, you should read the book. Or if you haven't, this new edition is worth having, and looking at the updates in this new edition and hearing from Pastor John again. This is a seminal work in which Piper explores the ultimate source of satisfaction, that God is most glorified in us, as John has said many times, when we are most satisfied in Him. Welcome back to Life and Books and Everything. I'm Kevin DeYoung, Senior Pastor at Christ Covenant Church in Matthews, North Carolina, just seconds away from Charlotte, and am good to be back with you and have our special guest. Now, I'm going to introduce him by his given name, and then he can tell us what he would like to be called. Reverend Doctor. Always sounds important, but somewhat pretentious when people introduce me that way. But you know, it's good. You've gotten those titles, and they're worth stating. Stephen Fix. So Grove City graduate, Westminster Seminary, California, teaching elder in the PCA, and senior pastor, PhD from Catholic University of America, and get to know your bio just a little bit more. So, Stephen, welcome to the program, and tell me what I should call you.
That's always the first question. If you see a publication, it's often listed as S.A. Fix, and that's because I go by my last name. I just go by Fix. I was at Westminster Seminary in California. We had a ton of Stephens for whatever reason, and so you'd go to class and you'd raise your hand, and professor would call on Stephen, and you'd all start talking at once. So I said, hey, just call me Fix. Nobody else has that last name, and it stuck. My wife, my kids, and everyone at my church now calls me just Fix.
All right, I will try to do that. Yeah. Fix. I mean, it's good. There are a lot of Stephens out
That's
there.
That's right.
Yeah, they're good folks, but Fix is unique. So I want to hear a little bit more about your bio, because we haven't met before, but we have become acquainted through this book that we're going to talk about, John Thomson's An Explication of the Shorter Catechism, which you have edited. And edit makes it sound like maybe you just tidied up a few things from this 18th century work, but you did a lot more than that. There is a really, really excellent introduction that you've given us, and a lot of good original research that's, well, nearly 65 pages of this work. So we're going to get to the work itself. Here's the endorsement. I get a lot of endorsement requests, and they're almost always for good books. And unfortunately, I just can't do most of them. But once in a while, a book like this comes across that, even though I didn't know Dr. Fix here, and I had heard of John Thomson, but I didn't really know of this work, I thought this is really interesting. So I was able to read it. I read your introduction carefully, and I plowed through the rest. I didn't read every single word of John Thomson, but I know it's good and what's there. So here's my blurb. S.A. Fix has done the church a great service by not only bringing Thomson's neglected work into the light of day, but providing such a learned and illuminating introduction to Thomson himself. Thomson's Explication of the Shorter Catechism is a masterful example of orderliness, comprehensiveness, and 18th century old school piety. Both Fick's introduction and Thomson's commentary deserve careful reading and rereading. So that's just an enticement to all of our listeners. You don't want to drop off this podcast because you are going to get 18th century old school piety here. Yeah. So Fix, give us a little bit of background on yourself, your family, what you're doing, where you're serving, and then how you came to be interested in John Thomson.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Kevin. Well, I grew up actually, well, I won't start, I shouldn't start there, but I did grow up overseas. My parents were missionaries. I was a missionary kid in Austria for the first 10 years of my life, and then over here. And through a sort of circuitous route, God led me to seminary, Westminster, California, and eventually to the church where I've been serving for 18 years. So I've been pastoring there in
And what
Bowie.
church is that?
It's a Reformed Presbyterian Church of Bowie. It's a little PCA church, celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. So planted in 1985, and I've been there about half the life of the church. So it's been a sweet place.
When I met my wife, her parents were living in Bowie.
Is that right?
Yeah, this Maryland connection. Her dad, who's now with the Lord, but he was a Navy chaplain. He was stationed at Bethesda. They lived in Annapolis. Well, they lived in Bowie and then in Annapolis, and they went to Broadneck.
Sure. Right down the
PCA
street.
church
Yeah,
plant.
absolutely. Yeah. Small world. That's amazing. Well,
I
Bowie's a
know.
great
So
location. It's halfway between D.C. and Annapolis, and so you have people commuting both directions, and a little suburb of Washington, D.C. Good place to minister.
So you're there at a PCA church, but you're also doing some teaching?
Right. So then, while I've been a pastor, I've also worked on a PhD in Semitic, ancient Semitic languages, which you say that in your board. It's Hebrew, it's Aramaic, it's all these languages that were spoken many years ago, most of them dead. But they help us to understand, especially the Old Testament. So that was my interest at Catholic University. Not really what this book is about. This book is...
I was going to ask. My PhD at least had something to do with what I'm writing. This has nothing to do with Semitic languages.
This is far afield. That's right. Well, maybe like I kind of have thought, well, Johnny Gibson, I don't know if you know him up at Westminster Seminary.
I was just with the conference with Johnny over the weekend.
That's right. So he does this where he does a little church history, he does a little Old Testament. So maybe I'm trying to follow in his footsteps. But anyway, the way I found this, I was first introduced to John Thomson in seminary, where Darrell Hart was he taught American Presbyterianism, and he really had a soft spot in his heart for Thomson and Thomson's work, especially in helping the denomination that early in the Presbyterian Church's history adopt the Westminster Confession of Faith and Catechisms as its catechism. So John Thomson led in the Adopting Act of 1729, and that was sort of his first really great work I think, on behalf of the church. So I knew him from that. And while I was studying him, my dad, who's done some family genealogical work, had said, hey, we're related to Thomson. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. How? Yeah. And, it turns out I thought that was kind of special. And then you find out Thomson actually had 20 kids at the end. Like, he married into some of them, but there are a lot of Thomson descendants. So
you're
it's
not that special.
Unique, Yeah. But then it was when I was pastoring, and what I'll do is I usually preach through a book of the Bible, and then between that I'll do a little topical series. And so I started doing a topical series on the Shorter Catechism, sort of catechetical sermons.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you start looking for resources, and there are a number of commentaries on the Catechism that have been written through the years. Some are better than others. But you really find yourself looking for more. And at the time, my dad said, John Thomson has this explication of the Shorter Catechism. You should be checking that out. And when I went to it, I found old PDFs of it with the long S's, so this early 18th century writing. And I started using it, though, and slogging my way through the typesetting, and found that it was really, really valuable, very useful. He was adding things that other people didn't have. And so I thought, this would really be good for the rest of the church to get access to. And it is a hard lift to get past some of that early 18th century typesetting, right?
Right.
And so I just said, approached Westminster Seminary Press, said, hey, I think this would be worth republishing. And they were excited about it. And so here we are.
Yeah, Westminster Seminary Press has republished a couple of Witherspoon works
Right.
that I introduced a couple of years ago, and so they're doing good work and grateful for it. Let's back into Thomson's biography by talking about, well, I want to get to 1729 in the Adopting Act, but let's talk first about the old side, new side split in Presbyterianism,
Yeah.
which gets confusing because later there's an old school, new school
Right.
split. So this is old side, new side. They're hard to believe. There may be people listening to this who aren't experts in American Presbyterian history, though we all want to be. So tell us what that split was about and where Thomson falls in that divide in the early part of the 18th century.
Yeah, that's actually a great place to start because I think in many ways that was part of what Thomson's character is. He's a old sider through and through and really led that whole movement. You know, they call the Presbyterians the split peas because if you look at our history, there's all sorts of splits. The first major one really was 1741. And this was coming on the heels of the Great Awakening. And the Great Awakening was a time where obviously everyone was concerned for the spiritual state of the United States. And this was actually something that it's often attributed to the Newsiders, that they were the ones that were most attentive to this need for revival. Actually, what's interesting and what I've found in reading Thomson is he agreed with them that there was a need for revival. The question and the difference tended to be over what the answer to that need would be. And where the Newsiders emphasized sort of a need for a sort of a conversion experience, sort of an experiential religion, the Old Siders felt like, well, Thomson's answer was a little different, but they felt like that some of that call for experiential change was done in a way that threatened their ordinary means ministry. So you had guys like Gilbert Tennant, who's a Newsider. He actually went into a congregation that wasn't his and preached on the danger of an unconverted ministry.
Right.
And this was actually felt to be an attack of that congregation's minister as a possibly unconverted minister. And so
understandable why they might take it that way.
Yeah, yes, right. Yeah. And if you read it, it was provocative. It was, and Thomson, personally, he expresses in one of his writings that he was one of the ministers that was in Tennant's sights for this. And so it took real offense to that, I think, and really found it to be problematic. And his concern was not just to defend his own, honor as a Christian, but really actually concern for the flock. He felt like this undermined people's assurance of salvation and was disruptive to more quiet piety, right? The quiet person who grows up in the church, maybe doesn't have a conversion experience moment that they can remember, and so on. And so anyway, that was sort of I think the main difference between the old side and the new side as far as how they understood revival should happen and what was going on. In 1741, now you're in the thick of the revivals, and at this point, and it's a sort of a long, drawn-out process, but there were these concerns the old side had with how the new side was engaging this, and in the context of the church, and there were these protests back and forth, and you get to the synod at 1741, and the two sides were at odds enough that they said, all right, the old side said, if we're unconverted, you shouldn't be sitting with us to make decisions for the church. And so the new side I think they thought they had a majority, and so they called for, okay, let's decide who are the continuing Presbyterians. They were short, probably providentially, by a few votes, and so the old side ended up winning that vote, and the new siders had to leave, and they met across the street, and that eventually resulted in actually two synods, the Synod of Philadelphia, the Synod of New York, two sort of denominations that then joined back up.
Which was old side and new side?
Oh yeah, the old side kept the synod in Philadelphia, which is where it had been meeting since its beginnings, and then the new side was up in New York, and eventually rejoined again, partly due to Thomson's work. It was interesting if you read the minutes when the split happened. The old side is there now; they're the only ones left, and the first thing they do is they they basically write a mourning, an encouragement to go back to your churches and mourn the split. So they weren't happy about it, and they started immediately working on trying to get back together, and eventually they did. After John Thomson died, unfortunately, he didn't live to see that, but he had been instrumental in the process.
So, yeah, that's a great history. They come back 58, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, 1758. And so that's why they don't have a General Assembly until 89, but
Yes.
essentially the General Assembly is called the Synod of New York and Philadelphia because
Right.
it's the reunion of that. And you mentioned Daryl Hart, and Daryl is I've read I think almost all of his books. He's a very good writer, very good historian. I think Hart and Meether's book on American Presbyterianism, I think that's a P&R book, is a great place to become acquainted with the history. But it's not by accident that you would talk about Daryl's influence, because Daryl is sympathetic toward the old side. And you mentioned here the maybe not the historiography, but certainly as American Presbyterianism plays out, it is kind of more the new siders become. I mean, they have the institutional heft. They're the ones who are in charge of Princeton. They really become to dominate the Presbyterian Church. And I learned not from any particular teacher. I just think the books I was reading. I certainly learned Presbyterian American history as kind of new siders good,
Right.
old side
Right.
maybe bad. And I think a lot of that was through a New England lens, meaning, well, Charles Chauncey, Congregationalist, that was sort of Edwards Chauncey. That's those are the bad guys. They don't like revival. And I have been, helped by Hart and others, and was helped by your introduction here to say, well, it's maybe not quite that simple. Is there a way? Is this just my incipient, poor third wayism, which I'm not usually accused of? But is it wrong of me to think both sides had something worth saying and preserving, and that this was a split that didn't need to happen? They both wanted to emphasize some right things. How do you sort through the sides?
Yeah. I think, like so often in church history, when we disagree on things, we focus on the areas of disagreement, and we lose sight of the areas of agreement, right? And it really is interesting. I guess sort of toward a third way, it really is interesting. Tennant in The Dangers of an Unconverted Ministry, if you read that sermon, you can see it is provocative, it is inflammatory. On the one hand, you say, of course, we want our ministers to be converted.
Right.
What a shame to have a Pharisee minister, as he would call them.
What does that mean? What does he mean by converted?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. And
Right.
to do it the way he did it, I think, which is a lot of what the old siders said, is the way he approached this was problematic. He kind of went around the church courts and the church orders, and he didn't honor the fact that these are ministers in good standing in the denomination. On the other hand, Tennant himself backs off from that later on. So after the split happened, he himself admitted that there were things he did wrong. He shouldn't have spoken in some of the ways he did. And on the other side, as far as the old side, you can understand where some of their reputation comes. I would imagine that to some, they seemed curmudgeonly. They seemed like they didn't have room for God to work in mighty ways.
Right.
As they were kind of focused more on ordinary means. And I would imagine that some of them did have a sense that this was their job, and they didn't want their livelihood to be threatened, and it was maybe less spiritual than it was more, economic or whatever
Right.
reasons. However, Thomson as well, I sort of to look to him, he's considered to be an opponent of revivals and things. And when you read him, you actually find that he is bemoaning the state of the nation and the church in the same way that the revivalists are. And his answer is not as far from them. He addresses the concern. One of their concerns was, do people actually have true faith? And the way he addresses that is not by saying you need this kind of experience that you can kind of quantify in this way. On the other hand, he actually kind of does call for an experiential sort of reality, and it's what he calls personal covenanting. And basically what this is kind of what we do when we lead someone to kind of walk through a prayer of confession and consecration or commitment to Jesus, which, you would encourage to a new convert. You can also encourage your own children if they grow up in the faith, if they sort of say, hey, I just realized that I really need to trust Jesus. You might pray a prayer where you confess your sin, and you might commit yourself to Christ. And it was a personal covenanting. That idea for him was that you actually commit yourself, make a vow to the Lord to follow him and to accept. He talks about, I don't love the way he talks about it, but he talks about as accepting the terms of the covenant of grace, which requires us to trust Jesus. That's the condition, right, to faith, and in order that he might grant us his righteousness and salvation. So, he is kind of still trying to call people to a personal, experiential even engagement. He just didn't like the means that were often used by some of the revivalists. And again, here you'd say, the revivalists are a broad tent. You have some doing maybe better than others in how closely they're sticking with Scripture, and how much more they're enthusiastic. And you have that even with Edwards, sort of trying to distinguish different types of revivalists.
Yeah, and I'm glad you gave a few shout outs to John Witherspoon and mentioned that he was instrumental, I think, in continuing some of the healing between the old side and new side, because when he comes over to be the president of Princeton, which is decidedly a new side institution, and yet they have some old side people on the faculty and a couple on the board. So he was a good compromise candidate in that he had connections to Whitefield. He was supportive of the Cambuslang work in Scotland, and yet he himself wasn't a revivalist in his style. And this is often the case. If you're an outsider and you come over, you can sometimes, you probably find that sometimes when I get invited to speak, say in the UK, and people will say, you went to that group and that group and that group had you. I said, well, I'm an outsider. I didn't know any better, and they didn't know any better. And so he did have that benefit of he had enough of the new side pro-revival connections, and yet he had a British education and a kind of gravitas that the old side he was able to. So there's my obligatory Witherspoon reference. Give us, we're not here to talk about Witherspoon. Give us the bio now. Lead us into John Thomson. We've talked a little bit about him, but where is he from? Where does he minister? Talk about him and why you were drawn to him.
That's great. And maybe what I'll do, Kevin, you mentioned sort of in this, as we've looked back on history, a lot of times you see sort of the new-siders as good, old-siders as bad. Mm-hmm. Providentially, the new-siders ended up winning out. So when they reunify in 1758, it's a majority new-siders. And actually, this kind of brings us to Thomson, because in some ways, the old-sider, new-sider debate in some ways can almost be drawn in the old-siders being those who were trained and brought up overseas in the UK, who were transplants. Scottish. Thomson himself was a Scotch-Irish transplant, had studied at the University of Glasgow. And the old-sider, he was long, with Gillespie, George Gillespie, and some of these guys who had been trained over there and came here. And a lot of them were aligned old side, whereas new siders tended to be U.S. trained guys. You had Jonathan Dickinson, you had Gilbert, the Tennants, and the Log College, guys. And the U.S. guys tended to be younger as well. So you had at the split, you had a lot of these old siders still around. A lot of them then ended up dying between 1741 and 1758. So when they reunify in 1758, you've really got a majority new side. So that when they rejoined, they considered the old side concerns, but a lot of it coalesced around more of a new side position. And so even all the way into the 19th century, as I trace in the introduction, there's sort of a positive view of the new side, because that's really where the heritage ends up coming from. Thomson himself was, he was born. We don't know when he was born. We don't know much about him from his time in Ireland and Scotland. but we think he's born around 1690, and that's just based on when he matriculated at University of Glasgow. He studies there, started being licensed in the church over there, and comes across to the U.S. in 1715. What I find remarkable about him, he comes in 1715. That's the first time he hits the minutes of, he just arrived, and he sends a letter to the Presbyterians. So they say, oh, there's this John Thomson, he just arrived. He's interested in looking for a call. By 1717, he has a call to Lewis, Delaware, a little Presbyterian church there. By 1719, he's the moderator of the Synod, which is like the General Assembly at the time. So just really kind of shot into a position of leadership immediately, and then just maintained that leadership position until his death in 1753.
We want to take a moment to thank Greenville Presbyterian Theological Seminary for their support of the podcast. You are invited to visit Greenville Seminary, meet with professors, current students, experience why more and more men are enrolling at GPTS in their Master of Divinity program. I love their tagline, "We train pastors." That's what seminaries are here for. And Greenville is doing great work in training men for pastoral ministry. Grateful for Jonathan Master, my friend, and doing a wonderful job there. So speak with your elders and tell your story at admissions@gpts.edu if you may be sensing a call to pastoral ministry. And they would love to send you a copy of Thomas Murphy's Pastoral Theology, wonderful work that has just been republished. And they'll send that to you for free to encourage you. Every Christian can benefit from Thomas Murphy's classic work there on pastoral theology. Grateful to our friends at Greenville for seeing the republication of that work and for their important work in training men for ministry. We also want to mention our friends at Reformed Theological Seminary. If you are feeling called to pastoral ministry, be sure to check out RTS. They have both a residential program and a hybrid Master of Divinity program, both of which can equip you with deep theological training, practical ministry skills. The residential MDiv here in Charlotte has excellent faculty. I know the other campuses do as well. And there's no substitute for learning hands-on and getting to meet other classmates. If you need flexibility, however, the hybrid MDiv blends online coursework with week-long in-person intensives to help you study without having to relocate, and that may be the most doable option for some. So prepare for faithful, fruitful ministry and learn more at rts.edu. You have this line really well put. You say, Francis McCamey, so every Presbyterian, before you're going to face your ordination exams, you have to expect a question about McCamey, can be called the father of Presbyterianism in America. It may not be an overstatement to call John Thomson the father of American Presbyterianism. That's a very clever way of putting it. And I think you're onto something. What did you mean by that distinction between father of Presbyterianism in America and father of American Presbyterianism?
Yeah, thanks. McNamee is he's considered the founder. I mean, he's the one who came in and started planting churches across, especially Maryland. In fact, the church in Rehoboth, Maryland, is the first Presbyterian church planted and dates all the way back into the the late 17th century, early 18th century. And so he really brought Presbyterians here and started pulling them together. But what I would argue with Thomson is that America is very interesting. In our Presbyterian church was the first really started here, right? When they began, they really didn't have ties to a denomination back in the old world, and so it began as a truly American Presbyterian church. And I would suggest, and what I meant by that is that American Presbyterian, in some ways, has a uniqueness to it because of that it really does bring in some of the flavor of the American experiment and what was going on there in the early centuries of our country. And insofar as that's reflected in the denomination, it seems like Thomson was really a leader in bringing that about. So he led in the Adopting Act of 1729, and so insofar as we as the American Presbyterian Church have always confessed the Westminster Confession of Faith and Catechisms, that's because of him. So that's obviously very significant for our denomination. But when they adopted it, they also specifically, and you've done great work on this, they specifically did it in such a way that they pulled back from the relationship of church and state that was in the original Westminster Confession, where the civil magistrate had a certain measure of authority to call councils and to do to exercise some oversight over the church, and they pulled back from that. Now it's debated exactly how far that was the case, but in doing that, the early Presbyterians were unanimous in whatever that was. They did it together, and that was Thomson's leadership in bringing that about. And then you see him. It seems like you see him unfolding that as he continues to write and work in the church, that the distinctiveness of American Presbyterianism is often very closely associated with the work that he did trying to guide the denomination.
Yeah, so let me ask a little bit more about that, because we obviously Presbyterianism 1560 is often the date it starts in Scotland, but the Westminster Standards are in the 1640s. And then the Glorious Revolution in Great Britain is at the very end of the 17th century. And so you really have the reestablishment of Presbyterianism in Scotland about the same time that Presbyterianism is being shaped here in America. And I think that's easy for us to forget. And the point that you made. So I originally from the Dutch Reformed tradition, and when the Dutch were over here, it was very much everybody, you had to go back to Amsterdam, you had to get your training here. Of course, you have the language barrier that you're doing things in Dutch. So it was very much, they understood institutionally, we are an extension of the Dutch Reformed Church in some other place. Now, these early settlers, they took for granted when they had to put their denomination together, they took for granted a lot of the Scottish ways of doing things, and some of they didn't call it a book of church order, but those strictures. And yet, your point is very well taken, and we can forget just how much they were developing on their own, somewhat independently. And really, you think just 50 years later from the Westminster Standards, you look a little bit younger than me. I'm not quite 50, but I mean, that's within our lifetimes. I mean, that's not a long time ago that the standards themselves were written. And now these Americans are figuring out, and it is related for sure, and they're going to adopt the standards. But American Presbyterianism does develop along some different lines than its British counterpart. Say a little bit more about the Adopting Act of 1729, and why that's so important in Presbyterian history, what it signified, and what the debate was about. You gave us a little bit in Thomson's role, and that was helpful for me. I had not put all the pieces together with Thomson's role in it. So just why is that such a critical moment in our history?
Yeah, I think, it's because it really is, as you point out, it's because the church was developing all this sort of in a sense, in a new way for the first time. The pastors and the elders who were joining together as Presbyterians, some of them came out of Congregationalist backgrounds in New England. So Jonathan Dickinson, originally Congregationalist minister, but was joining with the Presbyterians. And what you had basically guys coming together who shared the same theology. I mean, they shared a Westminster Reformation theology. And what they originally gathered together to do was not to set up a denomination, but actually was to ordain new ministers. So as those who felt a need for ordained ministers to be approved by the broader church, they were looking for that context to have a broader church weighing in on their credentialing. And so that was originally how they gathered, and they gathered as like-minded pastors, and so they all shared this theology. The problem was, the first time they meet is 1706. And so for the first number of years, there's lots of peace. They're all happy to just have found each other and to be working together and to be sharing their theology. As theological debates began to arise, as they always do, and as more people came in to be ordained, the question became, what are the boundaries? What are the limits of what a person's views can be that we're checking for in these examinations? And again, most of the denominational work at that time was examining new ministers and applying church discipline. And, some of the guys, and here's where the American spirit was felt. I think the American spirit was like, don't put a law on me. That is not.
There's always been that sort of don't tread on me spirit.
That's right. A little of a no king, right? Sometimes we forget the but Christ part.
Yeah, yes.
And so especially in New England and the new side, the people who tended to be new side, who were more American grown, there was a sense like, look, we know our theology, but don't try to force your theological strictures on me. And Thomson's argument was, look, we need to know what those theological boundaries are if we're going to continue to be together. What is a body if we don't know the limits or the lines of what means in the body and outside the body? And he argued, yes, this is a man-made document. It's a man-made document, although, we believe it's biblical. It's a biblical summary. It's a man-made document, but it is not that we are submitting ourselves to man-made words, but we're saying these are the words that summarize what we believe God to have said in His Word. And it took a while. He brought this a motion to adopt the Westminster Confession, I believe, in 1727, and it took them 2 years of debate. Jonathan Dickinson was very opposed initially, and so there was a sort of a hearty back and forth. And so the first publication that John Thomson made was in 1729, in preparation for their gathering, their synod at the time. He published the motion for adopting the Westminster Confession and a hearty defense of it, explaining why it was biblical, why it was necessary for the church to preserve the purity of the church moving forward, and to know how to apply discipline and how to ordain ministers. And I think to his credit, he's often considered a divisive character because he took very clear stands, and he led in the old side in the split. But to his credit, I think he ended up persuading the denomination so that when the motion came in 1729, Jonathan Dickinson was included, I believe, in actually approving that unanimously. So even those who were his opponents and saying, I'm not sure we really need this, eventually agreed.
We could be grateful for that.
Yeah.
We have some doctrinal standards. Talking to Stephen Fix as he chooses to be called. So, new friend and colleague in ministry, and we have a hard stop in about 10 minutes, so Fix can teach a class here. But we want to talk about the work. We've been talking about John Thomson, the man, and this book that Westminster Seminary Press is republishing with an excellent introduction from Fix. John Thomson's An Explication of the Shorter Catechism. So the Shorter Catechism, I think we know what that is, and this is an explication of it. What makes this work unique with many other commentaries on the Shorter Catechism?
Yeah, I'd be interested actually if what your answer to that might be, if you got a chance to skim through it. Maybe I'll start with mine, and I can hear how much you agree. I think what's interesting about it is a lot of the commentaries on the Catechism are either predate him or are from the UK perspective. So we don't have commentaries on the Shorter Catechism from the US side of things until a little further down the pike, a little further in history. But what I found especially, so a number of the really helpful commentaries actually are maybe late 17th century, so late 1600s. And in many ways, they are still very pre-modern. In my reading of Thomson and his commentary, you get the sense that you begin to get the sense that he's starting to ask questions from more of a modern perspective, if you will, almost a little bit more of a Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment perspective, which actually are a lot of the questions that we tend to bring as people, even 300 years later. And so in many ways, I find the questions that he pursues and the answers that he pursues to be speaking in a way that are very directly apply to us in our day and are kind of the questions that we, if we were thoughtful, might ask of the Shorter Catechism. And then his answers are very rich and robust in sort of, and in some ways show a developing of the theology even after the Westminster Divines in 1646.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and I was able to look at all of it, read some of it carefully. I want to come back to question and answer one. Yeah, I think what makes it unique, first of all, it's on the Shorter Catechism. I think a lot of the early ones were on the Confession. That makes sense. Yeah, and then there were a number on the Shorter Catechism since then. So that's one. Two, there's a comprehensiveness to it. So I think there's one way to expound the Shorter Catechism that's either largely devotional, sort of take this as a launching place to give a sort of sermonic explanation, and that has a place. Or I think many of the explanations come from trained theology professors, which Thomson wasn't, and it's really sort of theology lectures used through the grid of the Confession or the Catechism. And this is something different than that. It's very orderly, one might even say scholastic in its use of, we distinguish, further distinctions, points, subpoints. You could outline it very orderly. And he just keeps going deeper down every rabbit hole to say, well, but what did that mean? And then what does this mean? So I hadn't thought of it in your terms of asking some early modern questions, but I think that's right. It's not simply looking back to try to, and there's use in this, but restate, the differences between Lutherans or the differences between Catholics. It's looking now at questions that are coming in the future. And I really mean this. Anyone who's interested in the Shorter Catechism, especially students training for ministry, especially pastors, but anyone is going to be helped by this, by the sheer orderliness, depth, and comprehensiveness of what he's doing. Just to give one example, I'd love your thoughts on, so what is the chief end of man? This is the most famous one. The chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. I actually sent this Thomson's section here to John Piper. We haven't had a chance to talk about it, but John loves this, and John has also argued that we glorify God by enjoying him forever, and has done a lot to, what does it mean to enjoy him forever? And I didn't send it to Piper saying that John Thomson was for or against Christian hedonism, but just as a very interesting, here's someone who really, really wanted to drill down in this. So I know you don't have every bit of the explication memorized, but can you give us a sense of what he is teaching here on this most famous question and answer one, in particular about enjoying God?
So what he does is, it's sort of formatting for those interested. He basically takes each question, and then he has a number of sub-questions where he asks another question and a clarifying question with his own answers. Were there certain
page
ones
78.
Okay.
Yeah, so he's right. He's asking, he'll say question 1 from the Westminster Confession, and then he asks his own question. So he's on question 14 of question 1.
Right.
What is the enjoying of God, or why is it joined with the glorifying of him as part of man's chief end?
Right.
So I just found that interesting, thinking of, I've heard Piper talk about this many times, and here's someone from the 18th century who's asking that question: why is the glorifying and the enjoying of God linked? Now, I don't know that it answers exactly the question that Piper's asking, but it's fascinating that he, and especially as an old side guy, he loves the Catechism.
Yeah.
So he says, question 15, what is it to enjoy God? 4 things: to have an interest in his love and favor. Second, to have him engaged to exert and put forth all his glorious attributes as needful to make us happy. Third, an actual employing of these attributes for this purpose. Fourth, we are in some measure sensible thereof. Fifth, our sense gives us true. And he just goes through and explains point by point all of these things, and every point has another subpoint.
Yeah.
It's very
Yeah.
rich.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else on this question and answer one that struck you? And I know it's not fair to ask in a 300-page work, give us your take on one particular thing, but anything else here?
Yeah, I mean, again, like as I sort of mentioned a moment ago, I was struck by how some of the questions are not necessarily questions I would have. Like I kind of know what a chief end is, but him beginning with that idea of what is the end of a thing, and you sort of clearly see his sort of heart for. And I think you mentioned this, that Thomson doesn't come at this primarily as an educator, though he was one, but he comes at it primarily as a pastor. Seeing a need for sort of the basics to be explained. You could just imagine a kid saying, I think of an end as the finishing of something, and clearly that's not what is meant here. And so, what is an end itself, and then what does it mean to have a chief end, and are there other ends that are good? And he does say, oh yeah, there are all sorts of good ends, but there is one chief end, which then is the glorifying of God. And as you say, unpacking that enjoyment of him, there's a warmth there that I think is not often attributed to the old side, that they had a warm devotion. When you read Thomson, you really do see that he was not willing to compromise on doctrine, but he did love the Lord, and he wanted others to have a deep enjoyment of him as well.
Yeah, it's so rich. It is rich devotionally, and though they're seen as not the experiential guys, there is that element. And question 12 is about God's providence to man when he was created, and Thomson goes on to give a very nice mini covenant theology.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to learn here. Last question. I know you have to get to teaching yourself, and this is. I'm really excited about this book coming out. It comes out the first week in October, so pre-order. Anything else that you worked on this for months, maybe years, I don't know how long, that you walked away, a particular section you loved, or just an overall effect that drove you to want to see this published? Why should somebody want to get this book?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kevin. I think I thought of it as meeting people in three kind of categories. One is just the person who, I think we're in a similar state as maybe the Great Revival, where there's a sort of sense of like there's a Christianity out there, but there's a need for greater depth. There's a need for greater piety, and if so Thomson was trying to address that as well. And so those who are interested in the faith, where better to start than digging into the Shorter Catechism, which is a short summary of the whole of our doctrine, and then. It's thick, it's difficult, and Thomson will help you sort of unpack that. So if you're just desiring to understand your theology better, and you're willing to work through the Shorter Catechism, here's a great guide. Maybe you're a parent and you're leading your family in learning. I train my kids in the Shorter Catechism, and this is a great way to supplement. What is it we're saying when we're saying these questions? So on the sort of personal family level, for me, it was great as a pastor trying to preach through these doctrines. I think it's a great reference in that regard as well. And then sort of historically kind of interesting, I mentioned in my introduction that Benjamin Franklin published a number of his works. So he's rubbing shoulders with the founders of the nation in that regard. To call out a couple of places that I sort of was struck by that was sort of interesting is Thomson, as an Old Testament guy, I love the types and shadows of the Old Testament. And he has a wonderful place where he's unpacking, or he's questioning and answering through the idea of Christ as our high priest. And he talks about the typology of the temple, specifically digging into the typology of the altar as, in a sense, a type of Christ. And that, to me, I hadn't really heard that before, and so it's sort of a new way of thinking about the imagery of what the altars serve in the Old Testament. So he opened my eyes in that way. And another place that I just love is when he's talking about the seventh commandment. So he's part of the Catechism is that it just goes through the 10 Commandments and unpacks what do these mean, how do we apply these, and he's talking about modesty, and he gets into so the question of how should we dress appropriately as Christians. And I found it really balanced what he said. He said, we want to dress in a way that is not proudfully or pridefully looking for attention to ourselves. And that can be done in two ways. One is we can be at the height of fashion, always on the cutting edge, always spending lots of money on how we dress. But he said, but on the other side, you can dress way out of fashion, frumpy, and almost draw attention to yourself in a just the opposite way, in that way. And it was sort of interesting to me because I did a little research on what was fashion like in the early 18th century, and it was actually changing a lot. So to remain fashionable, you kind of had to keep up to speed with what you're wearing. And he argues that you should try to be in line with the fashion of the day, but not excessively so that you're just doing it to get attention for yourself. So I just thought that was sort of interesting, practical advice that I could see us
still very relevant. Though we probably don't dress like they
true.
did.
Yeah, that's right.
In the 18th century, but we could probably use some good lessons on modesty.
Exactly.
This is a wonderful work. I want to thank Fix for being here. Been talking to Stephen Fix, who is a PCA pastor, a PhD in Semitic languages, although this is about the Shorter Catechism. So do look for this, Westminster Seminary Press. I'm so glad that they're republishing John Thomson's Explication of the Shorter Catechism, which Fix has edited and provided a really excellent introduction. So thank you for taking time to be on LBE, and I hope at GA or some other time we can get to meet in person.
Absolutely.
And I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, and thanks so much for your blurb and your reading it and encouragement. It's been very meaningful. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you to all of our listeners or watchers. This has been Life in Books and Everything, a ministry of Clearly Reformed. You can get episodes like this and other resources at clearlyreformed.org. So until next time, and this is my sign off, and you can hear the Shorter Catechism. Until next time, glorify God, enjoy Him forever, and read a good book.